afternoon, and welcome to a joint organization by ELIAMEP and the European Union Institute for Security Studies. My name is Ioannis Grigoriadis, and I am a senior scholar and head of the Turkey program at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, ELIAMEP. Today, we are co-organizing a panel on a very, very interesting topic, Russian-Turkish relations. We have a very impressive panel with experts that are going to explore a topic that has attracted a lot of attention and scholarly and non-scholarly interest. We have with us this afternoon, and I will refer to them by order of their presentation, Dr. Stanislav Secrieru, who is a senior analyst at the EU Institute for Security Studies, Dr. Sinikukka Saari, who is a senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, Dr. Dimitar Bechev, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and Dr. Habibe Ozdal, who is an assistant professor at Istanbul Okan University. We're following webinar rules, so all of the speakers have promised to be very brief in their presentations, so we have time for questions and answers, and we can finish in time. So I will first give the floor to Dr. Secrieru, who has pledged to explore the economic dimension of Russian-Turkish relations, which of course is extremely important. It touches upon energy, it touches upon exports, foreign direct investment. So the floor is yours, Stanislav.
Thank you, Ioannis. First of all, I would like to thank ELIAMEP for joining forces with EUISS to organize this timely and extremely important discussion. Well, I will move straight to the point. I think if we look at the Russian-Turkish relations, we can identify three pillars which uphold what we call conflictual camaraderie. To some degree, first, it's a compatibility of strategic cultures. Second is mutual dependencies in immediate or overlapping neighborhoods. And the third element is economic interaction. What I'm going to do is I will try to unpack the rationales and mechanics behind economic engagements between Russia and Turkey. And to do so, I will look at the economic relations from Russian perspective to understand and explain what Russia gains from this relationship. Then I will reverse the angle. I will look from Turkish perspective, and I will end with a couple of thoughts about future of Russian-Turkish economic relations. Well, let me start by saying that bilateral trade exchange between Russia and Turkey in 30 years increased by 1,769%. Yeah. So a natural question is what drove this impressive economic expansion? And if you look from Russian perspective, obviously first element which encouraged Russia to engage was intention to increase exports of goods and as a result to generate much more budget revenues. Energy sector is one of the key sectors for Russian exports to Turkey. Turkey being the second biggest importer of Russian gas, and when the oil prices were super high, Russia earned equally to its annual revenues from the Russian arms exports, from the exports of gas to Turkey. So it's not insignificant sum of money. Second, the exports of arms, S-400, which are very expensive systems, are an additional welcoming revenue for Russian defense industry, which gets less state orders than it was happening in 2010. And then last element, agriculture exports. Turkey is the third after EU and China market for Russian agro exports, mainly wheat. So this is the first element which encouraged Russia to be bold in its economic engagement with Turkey. Second element is cooperation, obviously, in energy field, which serves Russian agenda vis-a-vis Ukraine and Western Balkans. First element is the second line of Turk Stream helps to deviate gas transit from Ukraine via Turkey. This year, at least 2 European countries started to import their gas via Turk Stream instead of using Ukrainian route. So basically, Turk Stream helps Russia gradually to squeeze out Ukraine from EU-Europe gas business. Second element, Turkstream as well helps Russia to preserve its important position on the gas market in Western Balkans. Beyond energy diplomacy and geopolitics, economic interaction with Turkey helps Russia to strengthen its hand, first vis-a-vis Turkey, second vis-a-vis third parties, and as well help to maintain or widen cracks inside NATO. To give you one example, Rosatom builds a nuclear power station in Turkey, which creates a long-term dependency in terms of technologies, training specialists, and deliveries of nuclear fuel. Mineral exports as well stimulate Turkish dependence on Russia, which Russia didn't hesitate to use several times to achieve its political objectives. I think another point is even before the event, downing of a Russian plane in 2015, Russia tried to use Turkish imports of fruits and vegetables to offset the embargo, food embargo, partial one, which it imposed on the European Union. And as well, sales of S-400 had stimulated tensions between NATO allies, and as well led to exclusion of Turkey from some joint military projects on which Russia has hopes to capitalize or speculate. Let me reverse and look from Turkish perspective, what this economic relationship delivers. Well, first it helps to satisfy energy demand. Yeah. So for instance, just to give you one figure, Russia's share in Turkish mineral imports, which includes oil, gas, and coal, is 38%, was 38% in 2018, which is not a small figure. Obviously, Russia, and I've mentioned, will become a source of nuclear energy when the first reactor will be completed soon. Second element, which makes Turkey to be interested in this kind of relationship, is increasing exports of services. Yeah, if I talked about Russia, which is interested to export goods, in case of Turkey, Turkey is more interested in exports of services. And two important things are here: construction sector, construction services, and tourist sector. Again, just to come with one proof is that if we look to the last 5 decades, Russian market maintains the first place for Turkish construction companies, 20% share. It as well helps to employ people. Some Turkish companies operating in Russia employ Turkish workers as well. It's as well helps to secure some contracts for business people who are close to Erdogan. So it serves several purposes. In terms of tourist sector, I mean, it's not a secret. Russia is important destination for Russian tourists. Turkey is important destination. In 2019, Russians came first, having the share of the Turkish market 50%. And then in terms of expenditures, while on holidays, Russians came fourth. Yeah. And it helps to sustain employment back in Turkey, which in touristic sector supports 8% of workforce. Obviously, cooperation in energy sector helps Turkey as well, not only Russia. It gradually increases the dependence on Turkish transit of Southeastern European states. Yeah? Instead of depending like it was before on Ukraine transit, now they will be depending more on Turkey. As well, I think Turkey hopes through Turkstream to gain a lever on Russia. Any transit country gains a lever on a country which exports gas. And we will see if Turkey will be successful using this lever, as they are supposed to renegotiate the long-term contract, which expires in 2021. So it's still an open question. And in terms of arms exports, imports from Russia, these kind of contracts help Turkey to boost military capabilities, to get something which NATO allies decline to supply on Turkish terms, or something which Turkey cannot produce. Yeah, and S-400 is one thing. And as well, this relationship with Russia is supposed to show to allies that Turkey has alternatives. And if allies will not supply what Turkey needs, there are other opportunities where Turkey can get missing military capabilities. Let me conclude with some thoughts on the future of economic relationship. I think once President Erdogan said that the ambition is to have 100 billion trade turnover by 2020. Yeah, the target has not been achieved and it's unlikely to happen. And there are several reasons which make me to be or to think that relations will stay as they are or maybe even decline, economic relations. First, we have seen Turkish systematic effort to diversify away from Russian minerals. Yeah, if the share of Russia was around 50% in 2009, now it reached 38%. So we see the declining dependence on the Russian minerals on the Turkish side, which minimize the overall trade of volume of commerce. The second thing is that the period of mega constructions in Russia is over. So you had Sochi Olympic Games, you have World Cup football, which attracted a lot of contracts, and as well, Turkish companies were pretty successful in securing these contracts. We have not seen any kind of new era of mega constructions in Russia forthcoming. And we as well can see in the statistics that the revenues of Turkish companies in Russia are declining. And I would not be surprised if South Caucasus, especially businesses in Azerbaijan, will become slightly more important. COVID as well hurted the tourism sector, but probably COVID will be defeated and in several years tourism will be back. But if Russian economy will keep stagnating, Russians will have less money to spend either for travel, or if they will travel, will spend less money at the destination they will decide to choose for their summer vacation. As well, the thing about nuclear, it's still in the balance. At least the first nuclear power station has to prove in Turkey its economical viability. If it will be able to produce electricity at the reasonable prices, competitive prices, and if there will be demand on the market for extra electricity generation. And I think on arms industry, I think Turkey is investing and building its own arms industry. So probably Turkey will try to avoid becoming too dependent on Russian supplies. And we've seen the example how Turkey find the alternative cooperating with Ukraine to get engines for its drones. And probably this will be the way out for Turkey to avoid increasing dependence in the defense industry on Russia. Last element is a sort of unpredictable, but as Russian-Turkish competition in the overlapping neighborhoods increases, the economic relations can be increasingly securitized. Both sides, or at least Turkey, may increasingly regard it through security lens and less through economic lens. And this can disrupt in this decade the overall economic cooperation between Russia and Turkey. And I will stop here because I think Sinikukka and Dimitar have much more interesting things to say about what is happening and what is going to happen in the neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Secrieru, for a very interesting and very concise presentation of the economic relations of the two countries. I'll now give the floor to Dr. Saari, who's going to move to the more competitive and more conflictual side of the Russian-Turkish relationship. So she will be exploring geopolitical competition in some of the regions around Russia and Turkey, whereby the two countries have been having conflicts or disputes about how things should disputes could be resolved and how the future should be organized. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ioannis. And let me just first thank you for the invitation to speak at this event. It was a very nice surprise. I would like to look at the Black Sea region and South Caucasus. And as the title of the event say, also explore a bit this kind of like competitive camaraderie and what could explain the logic and the dynamic in these two regions. I think there is a bit of a paradox here because I think in both of these regions, Turkey and Russia collaborate closely, and at least most of the times their relations are relatively amicable, but nevertheless, their interests are almost directly opposed to one another. And also their respective allies are also hostile towards each other. So what explains the fact that they are able to cooperate in this kind of very competitive geopolitical neighborhood, where actually both of the countries try to kind of increase their own standing and geopolitical might in the very same region that they share with one another? And I think that the explanation here, at least partly, might lie with the fact that they are not only competing against each other, but they also compete together against other powers. So it is because of this dichotomy or the dualism of the competition that they actually find it useful and also possible to cooperate. So in a way, they both need, for internal reasons and also for external reasons, kind of legitimization from each other. And that makes them willing to mitigate the conflict between them. Of course, there are other aspects to it as well. But nevertheless, I think that that is a key point. Some of the other kind of additional issues are, of course, that there is kind of similarities between the foreign policy style, so to speak, and also the worldview, that they kind of see eye to eye when it comes to the kind of more general analysis of you know, how the world functions and how states compete with each other. So they, in a way, they do share this kind of great power perspective and also a bit this zero-sum type of realpolitik kind of a frame. So I think that here the contrast to, for example, the European Union is great, because although Turkey and Russia are often kind of, their interests are contradictory, they still see eye to eye, whereas I think that in the case of European Union, although it might... could you please turn your mics off? Perhaps someone could mute the mic of Zia. Thank you. So nevertheless, yeah, so in a way, they have a shared awareness of the limits of the relationship as well. And they have a similar style of kind of keeping count, sort of kind of like what's the give and take in each of the situations. But I'm going to look at two key regions and two key issues. So first of all, I would like to look at the Crimean question and how Turkey has responded to Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. And then very briefly, I would like to look at the ways in which Russia accommodated Turkey's interests during the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict or war. But first, let me just start with the Crimean question. I think it is, of course, a clear starting point that Black Sea is kind of strategically and economically hugely important for both Russia and Turkey. And they both have very strategic positions in a way that Turkey controls the access to and from the Black Sea through Bosporus. And on the other hand, Russia, in particular after Crimea, annexation of Crimea in 2014, then dominates militarily the Black Sea region. And this was, of course, a very key consideration for Russia's decision to illegally annex Crimea. And I think since then it has really dramatically upgraded its military capabilities in the region. And this reflects very negatively, obviously, on Turkey, because prior to the annexation, there was the Black Sea was in a way condominium between Russia and Turkey. Not necessarily that they were equal as such, but nevertheless, there was kind of like this kind of a more balanced relationship in the Black Sea, whereas now I think it's clear that Russia has strengthened its position, and relatively speaking, Turkey's position has weakened. So how come Turkey is ready to react in a very kind of nuanced and measured, carefully measured manner? And the explanation, I think, lies in particular with this kind of competing together dynamic. So although Turkey has, of course, taken part to NATO's tailored forward presence, and it cooperates closely with Ukraine on security-related issues, for example, it nevertheless hasn't really reacted in a kind of very strong manner against Russia. It hasn't imposed sanctions on Russia, and it still kind of highlights the principle of the Montreux Convention. So I think in a way, Turkey seems to be ready to accept Russia's dominance as long as Russia doesn't present a direct threat to Russia in the region. And it probably knows that by opposing Russia's policies directly, it would actually weaken its own international standing. So in a way, this dynamic also functions here. But now I have to rush into the issue of South Caucasus, and I think that here it works the other way around. So this just highlights the fact that they are kind of keeping, they have a similar way of keeping count in a way that that in one context the other one is giving and the other one is accommodating, and then vice versa in other issues. And here I think that the paradox, of course, is that despite Russia and Turkey were really kind of, they were being allies with the opposing side of the conflict, they nevertheless had these kind of regular phone conversations, and they really mitigated and negotiated their differences. And Turkey was kept in the loop throughout the process, although it wasn't really one of the signatories of the eventual ceasefire agreement with Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia. So I think here what is interesting is that Russia still wanted to take Turkey on board, and they both gained in the deal, in a sense that Russia reestablished a military presence in Azerbaijan, and Turkey, on the other hand, got to keep had a kind of like a foothold in the region in the form of joint monitoring center. So again, we can see this competing together dynamic here, because by cooperating in the conflict, they both kind of strengthened their positions, relatively speaking, and in particular showed to the kind of Western powers and to the Minsk group that, you know, that they are able to have the initiative, and they are kind of the key external power. They are the key kind of great powers in the region, so to speak. So I think, in a way, this was kind of like the dynamic that you could see emerging here. I think this is a very challenging situation for the EU, but I think that my time has run out, so we can probably take up that issue a bit later in the kind of questions and answers session. But I would be very happy to share also my views on that issue later. But Dimo, I think it's your turn now. Huh?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Saari. And as Dr. Saari suggested, the floor goes to Dr. Bechev, who is going to explore Russian-Turkish relations in the Western Balkans and the Middle East, right?
In the interest of timekeeping, let me focus on the Middle East and North Africa, and leave the Western Balkans for the questions and answers. And I'll be very brief because I'm conscious that we have another speaker, and I'm sure a lot of questions and rejoinders coming from the audience, where we have lots of knowledgeable colleagues. So my first point about the Middle East, that traditionally the Middle East was a sideshow in the Russian-Turkish relationship. A decade ago, even during the Arab Spring, that was not where the action was. The action was in the Black Sea or in bilateral relations. After Russia's intervention in Syria in 2015, the Middle East has moved to the center of the bilateral agenda. This is where the bulk of the conversation and interaction between the two countries is happening. The last meeting between Putin and Erdogan in Sochi, just to give you one example, dealt exclusively with the situation in Idlib. That wasn't the case before. So very briefly, what happened in the Middle East, this turning point in 2015? Russia stepped in a very decisive way. Of course, the Russians had a policy of reaching out to the region starting in the early 2000s. Just when Turkey was opening, Putin went to Saudi Arabia. Many of those old Cold War relationships were rekindled. There was the Russian-Iranian cooperation taking off. But it was only with Syria, with this military intervention, that the Russians undertook. For a number of reasons. One is to save the regime of Assad, also to boost their regional standing, but also to engage the United States. But the moment Russia appeared in Turkey's backyard, that became the main focal point of the relationship. So what did Turkey do by way of response? I mean, of course, the initial reaction was to balance Russia in a risk-averse way, but we went to the brink with the jet crisis in November 2015. And ultimately, Russia managed to impose costs on Turkey in a variety of ways, not just with the sanctions, but also through waging direct war against Turkey's proxies in key areas of Syria. Also allowing the Kurdish forces, the YPG, to gain momentum against Turkey's allies. So ultimately, Turkey faced the reality that Russia became a power broker, and it adapted its policy accordingly. We saw this turnaround in 2016. Of course, I'm skipping the whole story about the coup and what happened between Putin and Erdogan. But basically, Russia, together with Iran, of course, showed Turkey the limits of intervention in Syria And the turnaround in Turkey's foreign policy had to do with the realization that they actually have to work with Moscow to achieve more limited goals in Syria. Regime change was not in the cards anymore, but Turkey saw that through the Astana process, and before that with intervention in the Euphrates Shield area in northern Aleppo, with Russia's blessing, it could establish territorial footholds and basically prevent from the pro-Kurdish forces gaining further ground, which became the principal objective. And equally, Russia, through Turkey, got the opportunity to set up this process, which excluded the United States, but also support the regime and also gain a fig leaf to reconquer parts of Syria controlled by the opposition. So that's the very sketchy description of the whole Astana process and horse trading. Of course, in Turkey's case, and that's a recurrent theme for anyone who has looked at Turkish foreign policy over the past decade, the relationship with Russia was also about balancing the United States in Syria and more broadly. So both needed one another to achieve goals in the country, but also to gain leverage vis-a-vis the US. And it has worked for both, essentially. We saw it with Afrin, and I'll get back, and I'll get later on to the situation in Idlib, what Turkey achieved by working with the Russians. So that's my next point. My point number 3 is that this model of relationship, of interaction established in Syria, of diplomatic horse trading to Astana, proved hard to export to Libya, which became yet another theater when those two regional powers started interacting. In fact, Libya is interesting because for Turkey, it's also reflected lessons learned from the Russian intervention in Syria. You see some clear parallels, and people have written about it. You had the government of national accord inviting the Turks to send a military operation. You had the same tactical capabilities deployed with Air Force elements, some naval support, and the type of operational formula where you actually support local forces and also dispatch proxy units, military companies on the ground. But Russia's presence in Libya is very different from Russia's presence in Syria. That's one. Russia is formally not there. It's the Wagner company. And Russia is not able to reciprocate the type of Turkish presence, especially after the Battle of Tripoli. But what is common about Libya and Syria is the capability of both Russia and Turkey to actually draw red lines one another. Because after the gains made in Libya, the reconquest or the pushing out of Haftar's army from Western Libya, Russia managed to beef up its presence, also in cooperation with the United Arab Emirates, and draw a red line to Turkey and also draw Turkey to the negotiating table. So yeah, there are differences, there are parallels, but we are not getting this sort of a Russian-Turkish condominium that you have in parts of northern Syria. Now, Idlib, what is the situation in Idlib? I think that was in 2020, earlier last year, the test case of the relationship. Because it showed to everyone that despite cooperation, despite the chemistry between the leaders and the habit of doing business together geopolitically, there are some points of conflict. For Turkey, it tested the proposition that Russia is there to restrain Assad and to some degree the Iranians. With the offensive against Idlib, the Russians basically went along with the regime offensive. But also kind of tested Turkey's resolve to fight back, and the type of response that Turkey offered basically proves, first of all, that it's a conflictual relationship, but second of all, and that's probably more important to our discussion, is that it's a managed competition. Very briefly, the story is that, first of all, Erdogan didn't blame the Russians for the death of Turkish military personnel as a result of airstrike, although we know it was the Russians, as it's nearly certain. They also prevented Turkish evacuation helicopters to evacuate the wounded. That's one. But Turkey basically used its escalation dominance in Syria to push back against the Russians. And after weeks where Putin was unwilling to talk to Erdogan and to the Turks, lo and behold, in early March 2020, they sat down together and they patched up things and arrived at some sort of a formula to manage Idlib that has pretty much proved resilient until the present. So this is a micro case study that exemplifies this relationship of fighting, whether directly or more likely through proxy, but also being able to go back to the diplomatic table and do business together, and also to kind of divide the spoils. Now, for Turkey in the Middle East, the relationship with Russia is not exclusive. Turkey keeps its options open. One message that emanated from Ankara as a result of Karabakh, but also in Libya back to the West, was that, look, Turkey is the only power capable of containing the Russians in this critical region. And they basically tried to use Russia to gain favor with the US, first with the Trump administration and with the Biden administration. I'm not sure that has worked, because the Americans know that it's in Turkish national interest. They don't do it because of being part of the West. They do it because it's what they want anyhow. But this game of balancing with Russia and the US is the norm. So I don't see an alignment between Russia and Turkey. My last point is about the longer term. We don't know, despite all the mileage that the Russians made in the Middle East, whether Russia is there to stay. Russia has relationships with pretty much everyone, but it's partly a function that it's not a regional power. It's not invested into the local rivalries. It can cut its losses and withdraw at any point. Turkey, on the other hand, is there to stay because of Syria, which, for all intents and purposes, is part of the homeland now, and the boundaries is very blurry. But also because of all the political, economic, and geographical linkages. So what we see now is a snapshot between Russia and Turkey is this kind of power duo in the Middle East. Is the situation right now, but whether it will be the situation in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, we don't really know. So that's the last thing I wanted to contribute. And again, let's talk about the Western Balkans later in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bechev, for your contribution. Last but not least is Dr. Habibe Ozdal, who will give us a perspective, a strategic perspective of the overall relationship that has really went through very unexpected turbulences over the last years. Like if we consider how the situation was when the jet crisis occurred, like it was like 6 years ago, and the number of visits and meetings of the two leaders ever since, I think it's a very interesting observation. So how does the Turkish government look into this relationship?
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. It has been very interesting indeed up until now, and I hope I will keep it that way. Thank you for the invitation once again. I will try to mention several points while answering your question, and I would like to take your attention a little bit to the changing nature of bilateral relations, or changing the role of Russia in Turkish foreign policy, or changing position of Russia. Because, I mean, all we know that the early 2000s marked sort of a beginning of this new phase in Turkey-Russia relations. Currently, we both mention cooperation and rivalry, but prior to that, we have been rather seeing this rivalry. So they built on growing economic ties between two countries. The economic aspect has been very important. It is still very important, but let me also mention that there is a huge trade deficit from the very beginning. I mean, of course, remembering that Russia is an energy giant and Turkey mostly consumes, or let me say, still is an important market for Russia. That trade deficit is very hard to overcome, but this is the nature of economic relations. So this more collaborative approach started at the very beginning of 2000s, fit well within the respective foreign policy agendas of two leaders that time, Putin and Erdogan, because at that time, both leaders were much more interested in deepening their respective relations with Europe and United States, because Russia was not yet fully recovered from its troubles of the 1990s and still was exploring partnership with both US and Europe. Let's try to remember that. Similarly, Justice and Development Party proceeded with the rapid implementation of EU harmonization packages in line with the party's stated commitment to join the European Union again. So at the very beginning, Russia represented one of the major pillars of Turkish foreign policy agendas. So Russia was an important regional power, having global aspiration as well, and Turkey could cooperate with Russia in a variety of areas. During the 2000s, what we have seen was mainly compartmentalization approach, because those two political leaders focused on cooperation and thanks to booming economic relations here, and they mostly ignored geopolitical differences up until when? Up until the jet crisis, we can see. This compartmentalization approach mainly aimed to see the spillover effect. You know, the progress in areas of cooperation would mitigate and eventually help to resolve some contentious issues as well. It worked well until the jet crisis. But the jet crisis is a very important turning point in order to understand not only Turkey's relations with Russia, but also simultaneously very critical developments took place in Turkish domestic politics, which affected foreign policy as well. After the jet crisis, I may suggest, in Turkish foreign policy, what we have seen is domestic sources became more heavily affecting the foreign policy agenda, and that has changed the nature of Turkey-Russia relations as well. What I mean is that the breakdown of the relations after the jet crisis created 8 months long suspension in almost all mutual ties, including student exchange programs, I mean, all ties. So actually, at the same time, critical developments took place in domestic sphere, and plus Turkey was not able to carry any sort of operations in Syria for 8 months. That also is sort of a long time of period if we think about how conflicts continued in a very important way in Syria. At the same time, the coup attempt took place. So imagine the Kurdish initiative, which was sort of an initiative started by Justice and Development Party in order to bring moderate and constructive solution to the Kurdish issue, that also has ended. So what we have seen is Turkish government at home in terms of domestic politics was restarted its fight against terrorism, and it even broadened this understanding, quotation, making any development in Syria a domestic issue for Turkey. That was the very political discourse of President Erdogan himself. So what was expected looking from Turkish foreign policy makers was that it's Western allies to recognize Syrian Kurdish forces, including the PYD, as a terrorist organization, plus to engage in a fight in Syria on its side, of course. But United States and European allies prioritized the fight against ISIS over the Kurdish issue that we can probably address, where deteriorating relations in Syria, Turkey's relations with the United States and the EU became very clear and obvious. Plus, at the same time, Russia's military involvement in Syria has changed almost all the equations, making that almost inevitable for Turkey to achieve regime change in Syria. So when we come to 2016 now, after the jet crisis of 8-month-long suspension, the coup attempt in Turkey took place, plus PKK, PYD, the threat perception was so high. Under those circumstances, Turkey and Russia restarted, or let me say, started to normalize their relations. Domestic environment plus foreign relations of Turkey were totally different now. Starting from 2016, I can say Russia was no more one of the main pillars in Turkish foreign policy, but rather the most important partner or loyal partner. This loyalty is rather a personal leadership relations rather than institutionally backed diplomatic relations. But that was the new clear-cut picture. So what we can see is that from early 2000 to latter half of 2010, the approach with Moscow had been driven by multidimensional foreign policy. But since then, since 2016, anti-Western sentiment has become a cement that binds Turkey and Russia together. The more Turkey's relations with the United States and EU deteriorates, the closer they became. But relations are not problem-free, therefore we call these relations cooperative rivalry at best. What we see is cooperation and rivalry altogether, from Syria to Libya, from Nagorno-Karabakh to Balkans. Those are, Turkey and Russia are led by two very assertive leaders. They enjoy almost unlimited political power in their respective countries, but still, and in the future, some do believe that this makes Turkey and Russia to cooperate in a better, fruitful way, but I believe this is a soft belly of bilateral relations, the lack of institutionalization, and we have seen this during the jet crisis. Yes, it may work well, however, also this is sort of a fragility of relations. Plus, I don't necessarily agree on the idea that, personal characteristics do work in terms of foreign policy, because it is usually said that Trump and Erdogan had very good relations. During the Trump administration, Turkey's relations with the United States deteriorated a lot. We have been seeing many, many crises. So this personal relationship issue is quite multidimensional, let me say. So yes, today relationship relies heavily on the personal dialogue between President Putin and President Erdogan. As long as President Erdogan stays in power, I believe this is going to stay that way. However, this is not in favor of Turkish foreign policy in the very short, medium, and even in the long run. What brings Moscow and Ankara together is not common interests, not shared values, even not common vision about the global politics, but rather the necessity of working together. From Middle East to Caucasus, what we do see is still those two regional actors who are on the area, in the region, who have to either work or conflict, and it is still better to work without even having shared interests, but it has limits, as we currently face in Idlib, right? Syria used to be, since now, used to be an area of cooperation, but currently in Turkey, at least, we have certain concerns about what is going to happen in Idlib. Nagorno-Karabakh is another example, and the Black Sea. I would like to mention those two and end up in a very short time, hopefully. I do agree when, I was listening Dr. Saari about the Black Sea and the Ukraine and Nagorno-Karabakh issues, but let me also add one point. The Black Sea is an area in which military posture of Russia has started to increase after the Crimea, and that is directly challenging in terms of national interest of Turkey. Turkey is not loudly expressing the concerns yet, but I believe intensifying cooperation with Ukraine should be also read as a way to balance this increasing military posture. While President Erdogan is that much criticizing the annexation of Crimea, sometimes even more than Zelensky himself, Ukraine President Zelensky himself. So this is sort of a very limited maybe, but still a reaction of Turkey, the concerns regarding to increasing military posture. Additional note to Nagorno-Karabakh, I am not sure whether we can really say that Russia was, they do give some areas to maneuver to each other. Yes, I definitely agree to that, but it would be probably lacking if we do not mention what was the relation, how President Putin himself had relations with Armenian prime minister of that time. So, whether it was very contrasting with the national interest of Russian Federation, the political change in Armenia. So there is still a limited role Turkey can play when it comes to Caucasus. This is definitely an area where Russia always will not look for any sort of equality, but almost a priority in that region. So Turkey, as long as Turkey's role is limited, it's going to be welcomed, but these limits are very broad red lines, let me say. Last 2 points, the asymmetry of relations from economy to security and political issue. That is in favor of Russia. And I believe this is something that Turkish foreign policy makers have to consider all the time. Russia is always going to be a very important regional political actor for Turkey. I mean, in the short, medium, and the long term. However, with this asymmetry, lack of institutionalization is strengthening Russia's position vis-a-vis its relations with Turkey, and this is something I believe which doesn't really serve Turkey's national interest. Let me end up here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Ozdal, for your presentation. We have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. So I would ask our audience to either send questions by text if they cannot speak up, but also raise their hand and ask the questions in person if they prefer. So do you have any questions? I have a question in my text, in my chat box by Mr. Kostaras. And it's not addressed to anybody in particular, but whoever wants to respond, I find it also very interesting. What is the current level of Russian-Turkish relations in the African continent? And he mentioned Central African Republic and Mali. And if, do these relations in Africa have a negative or positive impact towards the coexistence in other regions? Is there anybody who'd like to respond to that?
Probably I can take this one. I haven't seen that much. Of course, in Mali, the Wagner Group now plays a critical role, but it's not a core national interest of Turkey. It's not that Turkey has planted the flag there. And if there is a friction in the future, I'm sure they'll find a way to resolve it. But I don't see Africa becoming such an important arena. It's just too far away for both. Of course, the Horn of Africa is different. Let's add this footnote, because Turkey, one part of Africa where Turkey is really present is in Somalia, in the Horn of Africa. But Russia hasn't reached out there. If that is to happen in whatever shape or form, then it might become a bit more important. But as long as Russia is away from that part of the continent, and Africa is a vast place. We talk about it as if it's just a single, but it's a vast continent, and there are many sub-regional dynamics. But again, if Russia stays out of this particular place, and I don't think it's likely to be there anytime soon. Correct me if I'm wrong, Stanislav and Sinikukka. Turkey will be happy with the status quo.
If I might add, I think what I've seen in case of Turkey, its diplomacy in Sub-Saharan Africa was driven mainly by economic interests. What Russia does in Sub-Saharan Africa, it makes its way through security deals, diplomatic protection in the UN, and assistance to arrange elections. And providing security or diplomatic or physical, Russia gets some small business deals. Yeah. Second, I think Russia is a relatively latecomer to Sub-Saharan Africa. I think Turkey was economically active there earlier than Russia. But at the same time, I would like as well to shift a bit the region and to highlight a targeted one-off cooperation between Russia and Turkey in Venezuela. And for me, would be a question if there will be a follow-up or more cooperation, political or diplomatic, in this part of the region. This would be interesting thing to watch, I think.
Thank you very much. Mr. Yasar Yakush would like to take the floor, so please.
Thank you very much. And I was very much impressed by the contributions made by the distinguished participants. There is one elephant in the room that we try to avoid to see for good reason, because it was not in the scope of our meeting. It is the Russia's effort to drive a wedge between Turkey and NATO. This is of paramount importance, but so far, both countries, also Russia and Turkey, try to avoid raising this question openly, but perhaps indirectly it will come to the fore, or it is being mentioned behind the closed doors one way or another, as is the question of Crimea. Turkey avoids the recognition of the, or is opposed to the recognition of the annexation of Crimea by Russia. But if Turkey wants, Turkey's primary interest is the contribution to the improving the rights of the Crimean Tatars, which is akin to Turks, that question has to be discussed with Russia rather than Ukraine. So far, until the annexation, of course, Turkey was negotiating this question with the Crimean authorities, but now that nobody can easily expel Russians from Crimea, Turkey has to turn to the Russians in order to negotiate this question. And secondly, Turkey may have avoided the recognition of Crimea by Russia because it wanted to be in line with the international community and also UN Security Council decisions. So I think these are a few contributions that I could make to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would any of you like to respond or reflect on the points by Mr. Yakush?
Maybe Sinikukka. Can I say something about NATO?
Yeah, please do.
Sorry, I don't want to take all the bandwidth, but I mean, very briefly, I think, of course, Russia drove a wedge because in 2016, it engaged in hostile action against Turkey that went under Article 5 threshold. So NATO was proven useless in terms of helping Turkey against Russia, right? Economic sanctions, proxy military action. NATO was basically convened for consultation, but was not of much use. So that was a big reputational blow at NATO. But having said that, if you look at the Black Sea, NATO is very relevant to the Turkish strategy because that's the only way to contain Russia. And it's a cost-effective way for Ankara because it's not that Turkey is taking the risk to stand up to Russia alone. It has this multilateral framework and that it's not exposing it. So it's part of this Turkish self-balancing strategy, using NATO with tailored forward presence, and also using those alliances with Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, and to some degree Moldova as well. So Russia's build-up in the Black Sea has made actually NATO even more relevant. And it's the best thing ever because of this multilateral setup.
Yes, so perhaps I can continue directly from there, and just to say that, yes, indeed, I would agree that it's important to kind of not to see everything in black and white terms, but really see the different nuances. And of course, Turkey does balance against Russia as well, but it just makes it in a very kind of measured manner, and kind of avoids that kind of strong reaction that would then kind of decrease its own position and standing. But I think that it was very well pointed out by Habibe that there is this great asymmetry, and perhaps the relationship really functions because of that. Because it's clear to both parties that, you know, Russia is much stronger. So that just reflects into the relationship in such a manner that Turkey also is very aware of the limits and doesn't really push too strongly, or kind of tries to kind of in a very measured and balanced way kind of balance against Russia without kind of provocating too much Russia. So I think that is definitely there. But nevertheless, when it comes to NATO, and perhaps I could also take up the issue of EU as well, because I think that, you know, for the EU, this is very challenging, relationship in a way that both Russia and Turkey want to exclude EU as a security actor in any way, and also, in a very interesting manner, also restrict the security role of the NATO, but definitely the EU's security role. And also the style of the leaders, this kind of like behind the scenes deals and negotiations, and the fact that, you know, the relationship is moving much faster, that really poses huge challenges for the EU, that is very slow in its decisions, and also that would prefer a much more stable and more predictable relationship with both of these actors. So I think that they are both using this kind of unpredictability and kind of the momentum of surprise to belittle and push the EU away, and that is a challenge. But then, having said that, I think that at the same time, Turkey and the EU do have more in common. For example, when it comes to energy issues, there is much more cooperation, and I think that sometimes the agendas do overlap and the interests are kind of similar or parallel at least. And in those cases, and in particular in the field of kind of other than security issues, I mean, there is room to cooperate, but I think that is somehow difficult for the EU because it would just want to have much more consistent relationship with Turkey. But I think that it has been pushed to react, and it cannot really kind of set the tone of the relationship, unfortunately.
Thank you. Dr. Ozdal?
Thank you so much. Actually, Yaşar made a very important contribution by, mentioning this elephant in the room. I mean, yes, indeed, this Russia created a huge crisis within NATO. Turkey has been a very important NATO member. NATO membership in the public opinion in Turkey, it's been discussed, but it is an issue of discussion when it comes to domestic politics, whether being a NATO member serves in the interest of Turkey, etc. But those who do study foreign policy, I mean, there is, as we are quite sure that Russia's relations with Russia and relations with the United States are not an alternative to each other, but those are two, totally different political actors. Turkey's NATO membership is also very important for Turkey. It has been and it is. But yes, Russia created sort of a confidence crisis now, and it still continues. I believe here we have a bit confusing messages. On the one hand, yes, Turkey is going to ask for NATO to increase its role in the Black Sea due to these naval exercises, etc. However, at the same time, President Erdogan just last week was mentioning that Turkey may buy the second bunch of S-400 missile defense systems. It happens or not? But those are a bit conflicting messages. Russia is observing very closely the damage that it had created with the S-400 missile defense system. So how convicting is going to be NATO's, military exercises in the Black Sea? Whether this really changes any military already existing build-up there. So this seems to me sort of, Özlem Samberg, who is an ambassador, he was saying that diplomacy is actually sort of an art, because you do try to balance conflictual interests at the same time. So this is what we need here, diplomacy. But as long as diplomacy is carried out in a way to favor relations with Russia at the very expense of Turkey's relations with NATO and the United States, I don't really believe that this military exercises or NATO's membership is going to work in a way that Ankara expects to work.
Thank you very much. As we're coming closer to the end of our event, there are 3 questions on the chat box that I would like to ask in a sort of final round. The first question by Mr. Philippos Krinis. He's asking about the effect of the possible construction of Canal Istanbul on Russian-Turkish relations and its implications on Montreux Treaty and the dynamics of the possible presence of NATO forces in the Black Sea region because of the construction of this new canal. And Dr. Panagiotta Manoli is asking 2 questions. One refers to the Western Balkans. So what would bring Turkey and Russia closer to coordinate their policies in Western Balkans in the coming years? And the second question is there any real possibility to see Turkey integrating more in the Eurasian Economic Union? So, the floor is yours. Please limit your answers to 2 minutes so we can give time to each of you and still finish in time.
Stanislav, maybe.
Yeah, I will start with Eurasian Economic Union because I've covered the economic part. I think I'm pretty skeptical about any kind of or sort of institutionalization of economic relationship between Russia and Turkey. First, because there are different types of economies. There were talks in the past about concluding FTA, but it has not been concluded because of various economic interests. Russia doesn't need FTA in order to export its goods to Turkey. And second reason is that Turkey is really plugged into the European market because Turkey has a customs union with the European Union. And its production networks and chains are oriented towards Europe. despite this economic impressive expansion of bilateral relations, it didn't create the interpenetration in economic terms between Turkish and Russian industries. It's still a very simple trade exchange, yeah? Energy for services and in some cases added value goods from Turkey. Second reason why I don't think there will be no rapprochement between Turkey and Eurasian Economic Union is for power reasons. Russia doesn't need any player inside this union, which it created to lead a couple of small former post-Soviet countries. Doesn't need a rival inside this union. Because if we, for a moment, imagine that Turkey is part of Eurasian Economic Union, it will change internal power relations inside this union. And I think when President Erdogan mentioned attempts or willingness to get closer to Eurasian Economic Union, he had thoughts basically about Europe and how to get the customs union to be modernized, to get a better terms from European Union, to open this file and to get what he wants. That's why I think it was rather a tool for him and not a real intention to get closer to Eurasian Economic Union.
Yeah, let me take the Western Balkan question. I don't think that there will be a lot of coordination. Of course, we see as analysts, Russia and Turkey, put them in the same basket, but they're very different. Turkey, first of all, is a regional country. It belongs to the Balkans, unlike Russia. Second of all, it is pretty much integrated into the West, despite Erdogan's policy. It's part of NATO. It supported NATO enlargement. And also it's part of the customs union of the EU. In fact, the trading partners of Turkey in the region are EU member states. First of all, Romania, and then Bulgaria and Greece, much more important than the Western Balkans, by the way. What Turkey does is sometimes work at cross purposes with the West, competing with the EU, but at other times bandwagoning with the West, and that's not the Russian policy, which is much more confrontational. So maybe there might be occasional coordination, like in Bosnia, but I don't expect anything strategic, an alignment of those two. In fact, most of the time I expect that Turkey will be basically sticking to its sort of qualified Western policy. And again, the NATO expansion case study, Montenegro and North Macedonia, where I'm right now, is a good example.
Thank you very much. And the Canal Istanbul question?
Yeah, I don't think the Canal Istanbul makes such a profound difference.
Yes.
Because the Montreal Convention still applies. I mean, our friend Serhat Güvenç and others have written extensively. And to take a cynical tack, as many do in Turkey, it's a real estate project. It's about business, not about strategy. And Russia knows when it is a corruption project and can tell a security threat from a business scheme.
Mr. Yakush, you wanted to take the floor.
No, I thought that there was no comment, so I was going to make my own contribution to the consequences of the opening or digging a canal in Istanbul. There are 2 points that has to be borne in mind on this question. First of all, the Montreux Convention is for the balance of power balance within the Black Sea, to keep the Black Sea for countries that are riparian to the Black Sea, and not to let the third country, non-riparian countries, overwhelm the security balance there, one thing. So it is not the passage through the canal or through the Bosphorus that will change the situation. It is the presence of the foreign or non-riparian navies within the Black Sea. This is one thing. Secondly, for a ship to cross the Bosphorus or the canal, there is another impediment which restricts the movement of the ships, non-Rifleman Navy ships to Istanbul. This is the Çanakkale, Dardanelles. So a ship has to cross first the Dardanelles, enter the Marmara Sea, and go through there to the Black Sea. If it is not eligible, either from the Istanbul Bosphorus or from the canal, it will not be eligible in the first place in Dardanelles. So the question evaporates by itself.
So, thank you very much for a very interesting and illuminating discussion on a very, very important topic. I would like, on behalf of the organizers, ELIAMEP and the European Institute for Security Studies, to thank all speakers for their contributions. I'd also like to thank our audience for their questions. And I look forward to seeing you in another event in the near future. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.